welcome everybody for joining tonight. My name is Joe Booth. I'm the practice director and founder here at Class 5 Mind. And every month we host different events. And for this month, which is Sober October, I'm very happy to have somebody that I've wanted to get with us for several months now. His name is Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and he is the co-author of this great book, Brainwash. And he's going to be going deep in the science of habit change. And you might be wondering, what does science of habit change have to do with Sober October? Isn't Sober October all about cutting out the weed or cutting out the drinking? And from our perspective here at Class 5 Mind, addiction is a deeply rooted, insidious habit. And the way that we try and tackle addiction is from taking a holistic approach. Because what we know is that it's really hard to take a bad habit out of your life without replacing it with something positive. It leaves a void. Addiction is a very powerful thing. And when you take it away, you have to replace it with something that's equally as powerful. So you can't just take something away. You have to add something. You have to add a healthy action or belief. So essentially what we're trying to do is retrain or rewire our brain, building good habits while simultaneously eliminating the bad habits. And we know that little actions done consistently lead to big results. Well, why is that? Well, because we have brains and our brains do a lot of thinking, and different parts of our brains are responsible for different functions. And in this picture here, you can see in orange, this is our limbic system. This is like our emotional response. It wants something, it wants it now. And then the higher executive functioning, this blue portion known as the prefrontal cortex, is where that conscious awareness is happening, that processing. So it's about this balance between our limbic system, our emotional part of our brain, and that higher reasoning, that executive functioning. That balance helps us create these habits that we want. And we know that things that can happen over time with consistently is often said that the neurons that fire together wire together. And that's what we call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to build and reorganize cells. So whether you are struggling with addiction today, whether you think that you are in a deep, horrible state and there's no hope for you to get into recovery or to get into sobriety, I can tell you that there is. There is hope, and it starts with belief. It starts with little actions done consistently. Because of this process of neuroplasticity allows us to rewire our brain and find that balance. And what we mean by holistic recovery here at Class 5 Mind is taking the holistic approach of a person. We think about meditation, how that helps our brain, emotional intelligence, how we have personal mindfulness and awareness as well as social awareness, how we structure our thoughts, our words, and our beliefs to create good habits. We also want to make sure that we're doing things from a physiological standpoint that are going to set us up for success, like getting a good night's sleep, putting in food that is going to nourish our body as well as our mind. So this is holistic recovery. And it's not easy to accomplish, but it can be done with little actions done consistently over time. So I'm very happy to have on the show with us today, Dr. Austin Perlmutter. He is somebody I've wanted to be here for a long time. I'm so glad that the schedule's finally synced up. We have him for about half an hour. We're going to allow him to go through his presentation. You are encouraged to put your questions in the chat. I will keep everybody muted out. I will moderate the chat. I'll be asking your questions as we go along. And please stick along for the entire time because there's a lot of great information that we're going to cover here. Some of the information is in his book, Brainwash, and some of the information might be new to a lot of you. So please stick around, ask a lot of questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Perlmutter.
All right, guys. Well, Joe, thank you so much for having me. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I think it's something that just about everybody can benefit from learning more about. It's something that people talk a lot about and reference, but don't necessarily know the key steps necessary to actually leverage habit change. So in this presentation, my goal is to go over kind of the core aspects of both the habit research and neuroscience, as well as the more pragmatic steps that anyone would need to be able to leverage the science to change their lives. So when I was thinking about this presentation, and really this is kind of a fundamental question I've had over the last several years, why is it that we do the things we do? Why is it that we do some things, not other things? And then more importantly, why is it that despite wanting to do something, despite having the best plan, despite telling ourselves all the reasons why one thing is better than the other, we find ourselves making the worst choice? And so the typical approach that I see for people trying to change their behaviors is based in this faulty logic. And it's based in this logic of motivation and self-blame. So let me explain what I mean by that. Let's say you don't exercise. I'm not blaming you. Lots of people don't exercise. But let's say you want to exercise more. Maybe somebody told you that you would be better off jogging a little bit. Maybe it was your doctor. Maybe it was your friend. You decide that that's something that's interesting to you. And what the typical model of decision-making would tell us is that all you've got to do is care enough to get yourself out of bed, and you'll be that girl on the left. You'll be running the 5K, you'll be running the marathon. The only thing in between laying in bed and out there running the marathon is your motivation. And like I said, this is a faulty approach. What's really happening in the brain is that there's conscious processes. So these are things like actually thinking through, this is what I want to do, and then making that happen. But a lot of the time, the way that we make decisions is unconscious. It's based in these ideas and kind of brain patterns that are below the surface and we may not be aware of. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. When you think about a conscious choice, you may have a slightly warped idea as to what that actually means. The example I'll give here is taking a math test. A conscious choice, conscious decision-making is something that brings online what are called executive functions. These are the abilities that are given to us by, as Joe mentioned, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that lets us reflect on the pros and cons, but it also lets us sustain attention. It lets us maintain focus. So if you're taking this math test, which I hope you're not because it looks miserable, if you're taking this math test and you're having to look over these questions and you're having to do these calculations, you're going to need to be focused. And that means you're bringing online your prefrontal cortex. That is a conscious choice. Now, on the other hand, as long as you don't have a learner's permit, which I guess looking around, probably not many of us have, when you're driving down a straight road and the light is green, you're going to go through that light. You're not going to say to yourself, what are all the different colors of light and what do they mean? And let me weigh the pros and cons of going through this green light. You're going to go through that green light. It is an almost unconscious decision, and you may not have even thought of it as a decision. So the point here is that your decisions exist on this spectrum, where some parts of your choices are going to be really weighing the pros and cons, thinking through all the options, and a lot of them are going to be unconscious. As it relates to unconscious decision-making, the best example and the best way to tap into the power of unconscious decision-making is the science of habits. So with that said, let's go to habits. Again, I appreciate that if you're here, you've heard about the word habit before. You've probably even learned some of the reasons we form habits or unlearn habits. But again, I think there's a lot that's missed here. So I think it's really important to go over the basics. What is a habit? At its basic level, a habit is a repeating pattern of subconscious automatic behavior. Like I just said, this is something that happens without your conscious awareness. It's like a program that runs in the background. And the way that I conceptualize the need for habits is that your brain is actually both lazy and really smart. It knows that it needs to conserve energy for your prefrontal cortex. Good example here. If you're brushing your teeth, chances are really good that you're not thinking about brushing your teeth. Maybe, the day before you go to the dentist's office, and then you're also trying to floss and everything so that they can applaud you on your great dental care. But most evenings, most mornings, if you're brushing your teeth, if you're like me, you're thinking about something else entirely. What's happened is your brain has offloaded the actual process of brushing your teeth to the unconscious brain. It gives you the opportunity to think about all those really important things, which, again, let's be honest, they're not that important, but it gives your brain the opportunity to wander. So your brain is lazy. It doesn't want to use energy on things it doesn't have to. It wants to put that energy towards these unconscious other parts of the brain so it can focus on what is more important. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. The way that habits work is to offload your conscious brain so that these things can happen underneath the surface without you needing to worry about them. Okay, so that's all great, but this is maybe a more important point. Why should anyone care about habits in the first place? I mean, it's an interesting thing, but why does it matter? It turns out that based on some research from around 2002, up to and even perhaps a little bit more of our daily activities are driven by these unconscious habits. So if you think about how many decisions you make in a day, if you're making 10 decisions, 4 of those may actually be habit-based decisions. So I like to think about it as if you have a couple of people in making a decision for an important company decision, 40% of the time you're relying on this one guy or one girl. And if you don't know what they're doing, if you don't really pay attention to what they're doing, you might have some really bad stuff happening almost half of the time. So it's really important that we understand both the significance of habits as far as a percentage of our total conscious, or I should say total decisions, but also the role that they have and how we can manipulate them. All right, so I promise this will be the most neuroscience-y piece, and from here we can get a little bit more straightforward. Habits are thought to live in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. And you can see my phenomenal artist rendition here in the orange. But really what the basal ganglia is, it's a set of nuclei in the deep brain. And these are involved with a lot of motor functions. So basal ganglia tend to be involved with things like Parkinson's disease. They tend to be involved with things like dopamine. And they also tend to be involved with things like motivation. And so you don't really need to know all of that. I just think it's important to note that scientists have shown that these habits tend to be encoded in this specific region of the brain. They show that they're activated when habits are taking place, so that you know this isn't just kind of a fluff idea that's a concept. We actually have a concept of where they exist in the brain. Okay. So another important question, and one that I think comes up a lot of the time, you may have heard this idea that you can form a new habit in 30 days. Just out of curiosity, can anyone here raise their hand if they've heard that one before? Okay, so that's not new. It turns out that that was actually based on this one guy's kind of ideas and not necessarily science-based. So the best understanding we have of habits is, unfortunately, it varies. So this is kind of the study that people in the habit science field tend to cite a lot of the time. And I'll walk you through what this means in a moment. But basically what you have is variability between people, but also between the intensity or the challenge posed by a habit. The take-home point from this is the median, or kind of the middle amount of time that it takes people to reach 95% of a habit is 66 days. So on average, for somebody trying to create a new habit, to do it 95% of the time, more or less, is about 66 days. So let me show you what that means as far as a graph. Let's say you have these two different things that you want to do. On the left, we'll start with, you want to have yourself be the type of person that does 50 sit-ups each morning. This is the type of thing you sit there on the couch, you're eating your bag of potato chips, and you say, you know what, starting tomorrow morning, I'm doing 50 sit-ups every single day. Sounds so straightforward. It's not going to take you that long. So you say, I want to make this into a habit. And so what does that look like as far as how long it takes for that behavior to become automatic? So you don't have to force yourself to go get off the couch and do the crunches and kind of hate every single one of them, so that you can actually get yourself to do it without thinking too much. You can see here that this graph kind of goes up and to the right, and at around 75, let's say 80 days is when it starts to flatten off. And I should say here, the percent automatic, let's say here it's more like 80, 90%. But basically what you can see here, compared to something more easy, like a 10-minute walk each morning, let's say you want to make that as automatic as possible, it may only take you about 30 days till you have that walk occurring as an automatic habit-based behavior where you don't really have to think about it as much anymore. So what I'm trying to tell you here is, if your goal is to create a new habit-based behavior, whatever that might be, whether it's eating something more, something less, exercising more or less, calling up a friend when you're in the car as a way of connecting every time you're at a traffic light, doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that you need to understand that the amount of time it's going to take to make that a habit is going to vary depending on the significance of how difficult that is, with an average amount of time of around 66 days. So the 30-day idea is actually not that accurate unless it's something really, really straightforward. Everyone on board? Fantastic. Okay. So The next slide is something that I'm personally quite fascinated by, which is the questions of how does our interaction with the outside world influence the way that our brain works? And so in preparation for this talk, I actually did another review on the literature in this. And this isn't really something that many people talk about beyond the first one, but what this shows, what the research reveals, is that certain things, when we're under certain situations, that our brains revert to habitual behavior. So the best example here is stress. When people are under stress, they tend to make more habitual decisions. They tend to make less thought out decisions. I think this is something that we kind of all understand, but the other two are more interesting to me. So when people are sleep deprived, they tend to make more habitual decisions. When people eat an unhealthy diet, so in this case, it's people eating a lot of sugar and a lot of unhealthy fats, they tend to make more habitual decisions. So why does any of this matter? It's because when you are under these conditions, you kind of fall down to your habits. So if your habits are great, then that's good. You're going to now default to making better decisions. But if your habits are terrible, that means that when you're under one of these conditions, you will more likely make poor decisions. So it's another really important reason why we need to be thinking about our habits as a major component of how we shape our days. Unless we invest in our habits, we are likely to fall back to a very low quality of decision making when we're under these types of conditions. Okay, so that's the 101 piece. That's the stuff that I think, with the exception maybe of this last slide, the very basics that I think everyone should understand about habits. The next step is how to use this information. And this is the more pragmatic piece of the talk. The goal here is to engineer habits. And again, you've probably all heard of some of these techniques as to how do you create a new habit. But it turns out it's very straightforward as long as you stick to the recipe. What do you need to do to create a habit? All you have to do is tether a cue or a trigger, a prompt, something from the environment to an outcome. And I can pause and explain that a little bit more if you guys need to, because it's something that as much as I look at it, it still becomes complicated. The basic idea is that you need to have something in your environment trigger something that has an outcome, and it needs to happen many times for it to become a habit. So the things, kind of the core recipe items for habit creation, are consistency, repetition, stability of context, and a close link to a reward. Let me get into this in a little bit more detail. The idea is to create a habit, your brain is sensitive to things that you do at the same time, in the same way, at the same place, a lot. It's as straightforward as that. It has this little sensor and it says, anytime this person does the same thing, the same way, in the same place, and they do it many, many times, I'm going to take that as a message that I should embed this into my habit loop. So when you do things that are conscious decisions, whatever that might be, you are speaking to your unconscious brain. And if you keep doing those time and time again, you're telling your unconscious brain, pay attention, write this down. I need to offload this behavior because it's something that I do all the time. So this is the piece of it that I think is the single most pragmatic part of the entire talk. It's one thing to say that in order to get yourself to create a new habit, you need to do things time and time again in the same way, in the same place. It's another thing to say, how do I get myself to do this? And so these are the science-based steps that have been shown to increase habit formation. So we're going to go through each of these in order. First piece, reduce friction. Friction is a term that you've probably heard in business, maybe in other contexts, but it's used in habit formation as this idea of saying friction is something that makes things harder to do. So anything that makes that action harder to do is a piece of friction. If you have to walk across the lawn to do a push-up, walking across the lawn is a piece of friction. If you have to put on your coat to go to the gym, putting on the coat is a piece of friction. If you have to drive to the gym, driving to the gym is a piece of friction. If you have to make your meal and it takes 20 minutes to make that healthy meal, that 20 minutes is a piece of friction. It's really important to think this through because so much of the time we think it's a motivation issue. We think it's a self-control issue when it's really just an issue with friction. So the things that I think are most important to understand as far as the components of friction are some of those that I just described. So access. Is there a significant barrier, physical barrier or otherwise, between you and the thing that you want to do? If you want to be the type of person that goes out into nature every day, are you living near nature? If you want exposure to plants, do you have a plant in your house? If you want to eat healthy foods, do you actually have healthy foods in your home? Do you know where the nearest healthy grocery store is? This sounds so silly, but it turns out these are the most important variables. And it's one of these things where when you don't do it, you will blame your lack of self-control. You will blame your lack of willpower. You won't say, well, did I actually do everything in my power to reduce friction? So that's access. Ability. Going back to that original slide where I was talking about the marathon runner, if you can't walk out this door and, walk down to the end of the street, you don't have the ability to do a marathon. It's as simple as that. And yet this is the problem that so many people run into. If you don't have the ability to do something, if it's really hard to do something, your chances of doing that thing are really low. Not a willpower problem, but literally a physical ability problem. This is just the body you're working with right now. So if your goal is to run a marathon at some point, fantastic, but do something that's within your ability. So maybe that thing that's within your ability is walking down to the end of the street. If you're trying to create a habit, that has a high likelihood of becoming a habit, whereas running a 5K right out the bat has a very low likelihood of becoming a habit. And then time. So this is something that I tend to fall into a little bit, is I underestimate the amount of time it's going to take to do the hard stuff. And so if it's going to take you a lot of time, that can be a really big barrier. And it's something that, as much as you can, be a little bit more objective about what it'll take and start with things that take a very little amount of time. Some of the top experts in habit formation, one of them, for example, is BJ Fogg. I'll talk about his work a little bit later, but he talks about how, just getting your shoes on or putting your shoes by the door is something that you can do. It takes a very little amount of time, and that's the little habit that is going to enable you to then build to a bigger habit. So as it relates to time, if it's a big time suck, whatever that thing is, you need to put that in your friction column of your pros and cons. And then the last thing I'll say here, for the social perception piece, many of you here are actually in a group already, which is a fantastic thing, because the social context of why we do things is humongous. And if you appreciate that there is going to be a friction point because of a social perception that what you're doing is weird or wrong or silly, that is something to keep in mind. I see this a lot with people that I work with for food issues. People will say, I want to eat healthier. And then they go out with their friends and all of their friends are eating or drinking something they know is bad for them. So when you're thinking about friction, you want to think about friction not just from yourself, not just from your basic environment, your inanimate environment, but also from the people that are in your immediate surroundings, because those are a huge source of friction in our lives. Really important stuff here.
Yeah, question about that one, Dr. Perlmutter. Would you say it's almost the flip side for breaking habits as well, like specifically around addiction? Like if somebody's been smoking pot every morning for the last 5 years and they're trying to break that habit, keeping the marijuana out of the house or just getting rid of it.
Yeah. So we'll do this again when we come to how to change habits, but you're absolutely right. So the point is to say, if there's something that you don't want to be doing, whatever that might be, you need to think through the ways in which you can increase the friction, which you can make that harder. So yeah, getting something out of the house is a very basic first step. Calling up your friends and telling them, I never want to do this again. And if I do, I'm going to have to call you and tell you that I did it, is an increase in friction. Increasing the time it takes to do that thing by, say, if you don't want to eat something, you have that you leave it at the grocery store and you have to drive there every time. These are all ways that you can make something harder to do. And that's really the goal with something that you don't want to be doing. You want to introduce as much friction in as many parts of that equation as you can. Okay, so the next step here is to tether to reward. This is a really interesting part of the whole habit narrative. There are people out there who will say that habits are all about reward circuits. And the scientific consensus is that habits are actually not reward-based. This is kind of a weird thing, but let me break it down for you a little bit. In order to form a habit or to unform a habit, you do need to really take reward into account. But habits are designed to be insensitive to reward. These are things that you do not because you get some major dopamine hit, but because they're just what your brain is taken over to do. For example, brushing your teeth. You don't really feel so great. You don't get this massive dopamine bump from brushing your teeth. your brain just kind of used to doing it, so it will continue to do that. With that said, what's really important is in habit formation and habit destruction, reward. And that's because your brain is sensitive to reward. And so when it is seeking out new behaviors, it is going to continuously engage in those that provide the biggest reward bump. So the habit mechanism, as you know, is just looking for things that you do time and time again. So if you do things for any reason, and one of those reasons is because it's very rewarding initially, your habit system is going to say, oh, fantastic. I see this is something that you do a lot. I'll take over from here. So in order to do this, in order to form habits, you're going to want to make the reward as consistent as possible with the action, whatever that might be. Let's say your goal is to not buy as much stuff on Amazon, right? So your goal is to basically break that cycle of buying that extra stuff on Amazon. When you don't buy something, you need to reward yourself. I don't know what that looks like for you. Maybe that is giving yourself a treat. Maybe that's a pat on the back. Maybe that is giving yourself 5 minutes to text whoever you want. But you want to reward yourself immediately after you do the thing that you want to do. It's really important that it be linked immediately after. Otherwise, it doesn't build the same neural pathways. And to this end also, I'd say experimentation is very important because one person's reward is not going to be the best for another person. Last thing I'll say on this is a kind of fascinating thing that you're all probably quite aware of, which is our brains are incredibly sensitive to a certain type of reward as it relates to forming new habits, as it relates to forming behavioral patterns. Those habits, or sorry, those rewards are variable scheduled rewards. What does that look like? That's basically every social media algorithm out there. That is the red notification when you have a new message from somebody you talked to when you were last 20 years old. That is the email with a variable amount of new messages every time you open it. These are the things that condition us to tether reward more strongly with actions. So this helps to explain why so many people wind up spending so much time on things like social media. We wind up really strongly connecting reward with actions when that reward is variable. Okay, last thing on this list. It's imperative that we leverage change. What do I mean by that? Research shows that when there are breaks in our patterns, these are opportunities for changes in our habits. These things can happen to us sometimes because we choose them. A lot of the time it happens to us in what can seem like a negative way. But the bottom line is either way, these are opportunities to shake things up. So if you've had a change in your job, if you've had a change in your relationship, if you've had a change in where you live, your daily schedule, that is an opportunity to create a new habit. And that can be for the better or for the worse. So it's really important to keep this in mind as you're trying to change out your habits. Okay. Another important point here, everyone wants to get rid of bad habits. Unfortunately, the science suggests that you can't just delete a habit. It's not like you can go in there and take out that CD-ROM for a bad habit and put in a CD-ROM for a good habit. They're not deleted, but they can be replaced. That means you have to use all of these techniques to create a stronger, better habit than the one you had before. And so it's really what Joe was talking about earlier on, is that you can't just cut something out and expect to put nothing in there and replacing that. You have to have something that is a better alternative because your brain needs that in order to get rid of what it was doing before. Last note on this slide, even if you're doing a great job, remember that those old habit loops are still there. So this helps explain why people who had bad habits may be more prone to falling back on those bad habits. They're still there in your brain. They're just not as top of mind until, again, stress, poor eating, not getting enough sleep. Those are the types of things that can cause you to go back to your poor habits. So Joe, to your point earlier, what do you do to get rid of a bad habit? What do you do to replace a bad habit? You really don't want to, as it relates to habits, go with this cold turkey mentality. It's not how habits are formed and it's not how they're replaced. So what you want to do instead is you want to increase friction. You want to make these things as unenjoyable as possible. And again, leverage change. What does that mean? Friction makes things harder to do. So make it harder for yourself to access that habit. Make it harder for yourself to do that habit. You want to make it longer in time so that it's more challenging for you to accomplish that habit. And then, as we said before, you really want to do what you can to leverage the social perception piece to make it less enjoyable. Here's one that I like to do for social media. You want to also make the reward reinforcement loop slow down. Again, habits aren't completely dependent on reward, but if you start taking away that reward completely, it will actually weaken the habit. So what you can do, for example, with social media is take away the prompt that makes it so tempting for you to click on that link. This is an example of grayscaling your phone. It's something that all of you can do very easily. And it, in essence, gets rid of the prompt, and it also gets rid of the reward. If you go on Instagram and everything is black and white, it's just not as exciting, trust me. And then, as I mentioned before, if you want to break a habit, look for change as an opportunity. Okay, so for this last little part, I want to talk about some of the stuff that you guys have probably already heard about habits and talk about how that kind of factors into what I've just described. There are a lot of popular authors out here right now. I mentioned BJ Fogg. He wrote Tiny Habits. It's a phenomenal book. I highly recommend it. Two others to consider are Charles Duhigg, who wrote The Power of Habit, and James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits. They're both good books. I've read them both. I think they're both helpful. I did want to call attention to what they describe as the habit loop. So Charles talks about a cue, a routine, and a reward, meaning you get a trigger, you do something, and then you get a reward. James talks about a cue, a craving, a response, and then a reward. And let's see how these kind of build into what I just described. What both of these authors are describing is more on the early stage of habit formation. Early habits require that reward. They require that effort. They require that kind of cognitive conscious piece because you're actively getting yourself to do the thing. But late habits are less reward dependent. They're more automatic. And so let's put that into context. Here's the way that I look at habits. Early on, you have a trigger, you have a behavior, and you have a reward. And so this is the more conscious experience. If you've never had ice cream before and you open a tin of ice cream, you're actually not going to get a huge dopamine spike for this time until you eat until you eat the ice cream. That'll trigger the dopamine and you'll get your reward. The second time you do it, you're going to be triggered by, let's say, seeing that ice cream container. Interestingly enough here, you'll get the reward a little bit before you eat the ice cream, which is a whole other thing, but quite fascinating in of itself. And you'll complete the behavior. As time goes on, though, there really isn't that reward component. You're just getting triggered, and then that behavior is happening. So there's not all this conscious piece. There's actually not even that much reward. It's just a habit loop that's happening more unconsciously. So bottom line from this, later or more mature habits are actions that are taken without consideration for the outcome. You just do it. Your brain is on autopilot. It just happens. So in order to replace a mature habit, you can't just rely on this reward system. Instead, you have to ask these questions. You have to ask, what is this unhealthy behavior that this habit is causing me to continue to engage with? What is the trigger for the unhealthy behavior? What is the thing that when I see or hear or feel causes me to engage in the unhealthy behavior? And then you have to ask yourself these questions. Again, engaging friction and making these things more difficult. What can I do to make this behavior less likely? If your issue is that you're picking up and putting something in your body that you don't want to, how can you make it more difficult to do that? And how can you make it consistently across all of those variables that I described more difficult? And then at the same time, you want to talk about how can you replace this habit? So not so great to just decide I'm going to stop this thing and I'm going to go through the steps to get rid of it. Much better to say I'm going to do something else. So then you need to go through those same steps, but to create something that is enjoyable to you, especially early on. If it's not enjoyable, you won't do it. If it's not rewarding, you won't do it. And you want to use those same steps for habit change to replace that unhealthy behavior with the healthy behavior. Okay, let's summarize this for you guys. The main takeaway that I think really everyone in the world at this point needs to know is that unconscious programs, best example being habits, are shaping our behaviors. If we're only looking at motivation and self-control and willpower, we are never going to be able to reshape the way that we engage with the world. If we understand how habits exist, how they're written into our brain, how they're activated, and how to leverage them, then we can both get rid of the bad ones and replace them with positive ones. And my just general sticking point on this is, I think we've seen time and time again that the sole focus on willpower leads to self-blame. It leads to failure. This is what I've seen in my patients. This is what I've seen with myself. We just go through this one model, which is, I told you what to do. You know what you need to do. You didn't do it. So therefore, you didn't care enough. Your willpower was low. You're at fault. that leads to blame, and it doesn't lead to accomplishment of anyone's goals. So habits are a way of reframing this, where you say, let's work together on changing your brain to make your unconscious brain capable of making better decisions.
Loved that. Loved the end, man, when you're talking about basically the mindfulness component. I really like that. What is it? What triggers it? How can I make it harder? And then how can I replace it with something healthy?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's not complicated, right? It's not a complicated thing. If you want to do something, you make that thing easier to do. If you want not to do something, make it harder to do. But what most people don't do is even be willing to think that there are unconscious roles of your brain in what you do. And then two, they don't combine these things. This is what makes it so powerful. It's not just increasing friction. It's making it harder for you to do it in other ways. It's getting that social proof, or that, I guess, social context where other people are helping you to make the better steps. So really what we're talking about here is designing your life such that it's not just happening to you, and it's designing your future brain. This is the piece that, again, I think is hugely undervalued. And that is, your biggest control over your future is by designing your future brain. It's not in changing what you do in this moment. In this moment, you only have a finite amount of resources available. You have your cognitive control, you have your self-control, and you're going to have so much of it, right? You have your habits. Maybe they're good, maybe they're not, but they're kind of already there. But if you talk about how your brain's going to react tomorrow, in a week from now, in 3 weeks from now, in 66 days from now, these are the types of things that really give you the ability to change your life. And I think it's the ability to look forward that is so lacking right now. We're all trying to just fix everything on the spot. And until we're willing to look even a little bit ahead, it's really hard to make changes.
Well put. So here at Class 5 Mind, we refer to that as who am I becoming? Constantly thinking about the actions that we're taking, mindfulness of what's going on, and who am I becoming? Who do I want to be? So I love the way that this all kind of circles back to that.
It's such a good question. I see one question from Laura about sugar and habits and how sugar makes habits harder to break. So this is, like I said, this is the thing that fascinates me most, is wondering about how the inputs into our bodies and our brains change our behavior. And as it relates to sugar, I could talk about sugar for a long time, but I won't. Sugar disables our long-term health and happiness, and it does that in many ways. One is from a more body-based perspective, and that's, increasing our risk of diabetes, of heart disease, of getting cancers, all the things that no one really wants. But what does it do in the brain? Increased sugar consumption is linked to a variety of negative outcomes, linked to cognitive decline. But the pathway that I think is most relevant for most people is that excessive sugar consumption seems to upregulate inflammation in the body. Why does that matter? It's because inflammation, we talk about it as, oh, it's such a bad thing. Inflammation is necessary, but inflammation has a bunch of different flavors. And the flavor that's really bad, and the one that we get from excessive sugar consumption, is a chronic inflammation where you have elevation of these molecules called cytokines. And these cytokines can go from the periphery of the body into the brain. And when they go into the brain, they seem to trigger depression, and they seem to dysregulate our ability to make well thought out decisions. So there's a lot I could say about that, but to answer the question from Laura, so there is a study that shows that consumption of unhealthy foods, and in this case, they looked at sugars as well as certain types of fat, is linked to more habitual type decisions. So there is that human data showing that there is the connection between sucrose, glucose consumption, and more habitual decisions.
Great question. So another question coming in from Wesley F. Thanks for joining, Wesley.
Yeah, this is a phenomenal question. This is a question about awareness. How do you increase awareness? I feel like this is one of these more meta questions that is at the core of so many other things. The framework that I'm using right now is, step one is experience and explore. That in order to increase awareness, you need to have more experiences. You need to have more exposure to new things. So that's as simple as, if you're in this lecture right now, you're increasing your awareness. These are maybe some things that you learned tonight that you didn't know before. But you have to have new data points to increase awareness. And I think there are a lot of different ways that you can collect that data. It can be through meditation. It can be through exercise. It can be through conversations or group work with others. You just need to be exposed to new data points. And then as that happens, you're going to find you are focused on some type of pattern in the data, whatever that might mean for you. That is literally awareness. You have become aware of a new pattern. As it relates to how do you get more aware of your self-sabotage patterns, yeah, I mean, that's a great question. As far as what I would recommend is just going through and being a little bit more systematic about working on the voice in your head as much as there are a couple of books I read. The Untethered Soul, I think, is a phenomenal one, but I think that everyone's going to have their different ideas as to how do you distance yourself from the voice in your head that we all have, that in many cases is just putting out a whole bunch of negative self-talk. What is the best thing to do when someone is trying a new habit, yet it's linked to a bad habit and for a moment they fail? Yeah, okay, great question. If you're trying to change a habit, chances are it's been there for a little while. And we know from neuroplasticity that the more you do something, the more you do something. It's kind of a double-edged sword. So if you are somebody who eats healthy all the time, you will probably continue to eat healthy because your brain is wired for you to eat healthy. If you do something that is unhealthy, you may continue to do that. Chances are, if you do one of these things, you are going to fail. And so I was looking at research today that it asked the question of what happens if you skip? What happens if you fail your habit? You're trying to eat an apple a day and you don't eat the apple on the 12th day. It turns out that it doesn't actually make a huge dent in your progress, but obviously the more that you break that habit, the worse. What I would do is, if it's a consistent thing, if you skip multiple days, it's some sort of a flaw in your weighing the, as I said before, making something easy versus making something hard. So maybe you didn't make it hard enough to get rid of the old one. Maybe you didn't make it easy enough to replace the new one. And usually that seems to fix the problem.
So this next question is regarding substance abuse and any strategies that you've heard of or have experience with for breaking the bad habit regarding substance abuse.
Well, so I know you mentioned this earlier on as far as what is the connection between substance use, or specifically addiction, and habit formation. And I spent some time today actually looking through that research. There's a decent amount of disagreement within researchers as to how much habits and addiction, or whether they're the same thing, whether there is significant overlap, or whether they're more separate. And the bottom line is those things are interrelated, but they're not exactly the same thing. And part of the reason for that is because in addiction, the neurochemistry is slightly different and the locations of the neurochemistry is slightly different. So for habit formation, you're actually looking at a specific part of the basal ganglia. For addiction, it seems like it's dopamine circuits that are nearby, but not exactly the same. And in addictive actions, it seems like it's more of a question of a prefrontal cortex and another part of the brain. I'm sorry to bore you guys with the neuro anatomy, but called the nucleus accumbens, which is thought to be the reward center of the brain, where there are these endogenous opioids that we form. And so it's really the dopamine that goes to this nucleus accumbens that creates the feeling of pleasure. And it's kind of the strain between the prefrontal cortex telling you to make good decisions and the reward-based circuitry telling you, no, we need this right now. And so then the question is, how does that integrate into habit formation? Well, these are all still decisions that we're making, whether good decisions or bad decisions. If you decide to reach for something that you don't want to, you're still making that choice. So it's really talking about habits as, I think, a principal tool in changing behavior, whatever that behavior might be. And so that's the way that I look at habits. It's saying, what are the behaviors that I'm doing on a day-to-day, and how can I see which of those are more unconscious and are habit-driven? And of those, which are the ones that I want to change? And then using these habit-based tactics. As it relates to more of the conscious decision-making, Joe alluded to this earlier on, but I think it's really important to use strategies that engage the prefrontal cortex and give you more of that conscious control over your conscious decision-making. Now, a lot of these are the things that we've kind of already talked about and that Joe mentioned as well, but it turns out that sleep deficit, not getting good sleep for one night, can actually compromise the prefrontal cortex's ability to help you make good decisions. It's the same thing with diet. It's the same thing with exercise, the same thing with meditation and mindfulness. But I think, what I would say is that for habit formation, that is a double-edged sword, and it's a tool that you can use for whatever the behavior is that you want to change. but you need to still leverage those same steps. I mean, it gets kind of annoying because you think, oh, there's got to be all this really deep information to habits. They're available to us. The steps that we use to create them are very basic. It's just a question of, are you able to put together a plan to get those steps to happen such that you do this thing consistently in the same way or same places with initially a reward enough to ingrain that into your brain.
Dr. Perlmutter, I think the analogy that you have about the boat being the brain and the lake and trying to get across the lake and the holes in the boat is a great example of how you need to repair your brain in order to become more consistent and be able to accomplish your goals. So can you expand on that analogy and or maybe just say it better than I did?
I think you did a great job, Joe. Thank you. Yeah. So this gets back to another kind of key concept that we talk about in the book, but also something that I really believe, which is when you look at the things that you want in life, whatever that might be, whether it's making more money or having better relationships or losing weight or having better mental health, you have to understand that all of these things are channeled through the brain. We talk about these diseases of the mind, let's say, but I don't really know what the mind is. I know what the brain is, and I know that they have shown that, for example, in people with depression and people with anxiety, there are different patterns of brain activation. There are different levels of these immune markers, these cytokines, in people with depression versus somebody who doesn't have depression. There are different levels of hormones that change the brain, like cortisol, the stress hormone, in people with anxiety versus people without anxiety. And so what I tell people is, whatever your thing is, whatever your challenge is, whatever it is you're trying to change, I really think that starting with the brain is the best step, because that is literally your computer, right? If your computer doesn't work, if your operating system doesn't work, you can put in whatever software you want, whether that's eating healthier, better relationships, whatever. If the computer can't run it, it's not going to matter. So it's the example of the boat, but with a computer. The bottom line is, if you're trying to get from A to B, you've got to fix the engine, the vehicle, and that's your brain, because otherwise nothing else is going to stick. It's getting to the root cause. And it's also, if you think about how you experience life, it's through the brain. If you're happy or sad, or if you're feeling optimistic or pessimistic, these are reflections of your brain state. We have the tools to change our brain state, and yet we don't like to look at it because we instead like to think about, oh, well, I'll just figure it out on the spot. And if I'm happy, it's because I'm happy. There's nothing more to it. It's because I'm in a happy mood. Turns out, no, it's because of the way that your brain is wired and the way that your brain is interacting with the environment. You can't always change the environment, but you can change your brain.
I love it. That's a great one to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Perlmutter, for coming on and sharing your expertise. I want to remind everybody of his book, Brainwash. Amazingly, he is the co-author, wrote it with his dad, who is also a thought leader in this space. I got to tell you, if you Google either one of these gentlemen, you're going to learn a ton. You're going to go down the rabbit hole on a lot of really positive information. And what I love about this Dr. Perlmutter is that he understands the holistic approach, the integrative approach. It's not just about one thing. You've heard him talk about access to the outdoors, getting better sleep, diet, meditation. These are all things that we talk about in Class 5 Mind. And lastly, a little plug for the program, because if you are struggling with substance abuse, I really want you to know that you can improve your life. I was where you are today many years ago. I was struggling. I tried to break the habit all by myself and I couldn't do it. It was until I finally was humble and courageous enough to reach out for help that I was able to get over the addictions that I had in my life. And for many years, we've been working on putting together this program, and it's come to fruition. And this is what it is. We work with people to help establish a daily wake-up time. We have a workbook that helps you be more mindful of your routines, establishing an evening and morning mindset work, guided meditations every single day, and then weekly routines around field guide and work activities. Group meeting, which we do every Monday night from 6 to 7, one-on-one accountability sessions with somebody from our team, and an entire e-learning series that's all on demand. So if you or somebody you know is struggling, I really want to encourage you to take the time to schedule a consultation call with us. And with that, I want to thank again Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and I want to thank all of you guys for taking the time to do this for yourself tonight. I hope you guys all have a great evening and keep coming back. It all works if you work it. Thanks everybody. Have
Thanks,
a great
everybody.
night.